Mrs. Wilson stood at her living room window, fingers parting the cream-colored curtains just enough to spy on the activity next door. Her thin lips pressed together in a tight line, and her eyes narrowed as she watched people gathering in the backyard. What really made her blood pressure rise was the sight of that blue-skinned woman with the strange glowing patterns across her face and arms. The creature moved with an unnatural grace beside the human man who had moved in last year. Disgusting, Mrs. Wilson muttered to herself, letting the curtain fall back for a moment. People marrying those things now. What's this world coming to? She had tolerated the strange woman visiting for months now, but this was too much. The decorations had gone up yesterday. White chairs arranged in neat rows, an arch covered with flowers, and tiny lights strung through the trees. It wasn't hard to figure out what was happening. They were actually getting married, right here in their backyard, as if it were perfectly normal. Mrs. Wilson grabbed her phone from the side table and dialed with shaking fingers. When the operator answered, she spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. Police. Yes, this is Margaret Wilson at 247 Maple Street. There's suspicious alien activity next door at 249. They're gathering in large numbers for some kind of ceremony. I don't feel safe. It might be dangerous. You know how those blue ones can be unpredictable. She hung up and returned to her post at the window, pulling the curtain aside again. More humans were arriving now, taking seats in the white chairs. Some of them wore formal clothes, while others had incorporated strange, colorful fabrics that must be alien fashion. A few even had small symbols painted on their faces, humans trying to act like aliens. It made her stomach turn. Across the fence in the neighboring yard, Amir Rahman stood before a mirror in the small garden shed they'd converted into a groom's preparation area. His dark fingers fumbled with his bow tie for the third time. The royal blue fabric matched the natural skin tone of his bride, a detail that had seemed romantic when they'd picked it out. Now the color just made his nerves worse. Need help with that? His best friend Jason asked, leaning against the doorframe. I can't seem to get it right, Amir admitted, his voice strained. My hands won't stop shaking. Wedding jitters are normal, Jason said, stepping forward to help. Even for interstellar marriages. It's not just that, Amir said quietly. I want everything to be perfect for Layla. She's given up so much to be here. Her family should be sitting out there right now. Outside, the guests continued to arrive. Amir's side filled quickly. His parents in the front row, his 3 sisters with their families, cousins, aunts, uncles, and friends from medical school where he worked as a nurse. But the right side of the aisle remained noticeably empty, with just a handful of Layla's Earth friends scattered among the many vacant chairs. Those empty seats represented Layla's family, her parents, siblings, and extended clan who remained 16 light-years away on their home world. The current travel restrictions between Earth and Vexilia meant they could only attend via the small holographic projector set up on the front row. It wasn't the same, and everyone knew it. In the master bedroom of the house, Layla stood before a full-length mirror, trying to hold back tears that threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup. Her blue skin seemed to shimmer with emotion, the natural bioluminescent patterns across her shoulders and cheeks glowing more intensely with her feelings. You look beautiful, said Amir's mother, Fatima, adjusting the veil carefully around Layla's face. Unlike her son's nervous hands, Fatima's fingers moved with calm precision, treating Layla's ceremonial head covering with the same care she would give to a human bride. Thank you, Layla replied, her voice musical with the slight accent all Vexilians had when speaking English. I just wish my mother could be here to see this. She can see you through the projection, Fatima reminded her gently. And she is with you in spirit. Layla nodded, touching the small crystal pendant at her throat, a family heirloom her mother had sent from Vexilia for the wedding. It was small comfort, but it was something. Outside, the officiant took his place at the flower-covered arch. Amir walked out to stand beside him, hands clasped before him to hide their trembling. The musicians began to play, a beautiful hybrid composition that blended traditional human wedding music with the haunting tones of Vexillian ceremonial songs. Guests turned in their seats as Layla appeared at the back of the aisle. Her gown was a stunning creation of white silk with accents of blue that matched her skin and delicate patterns embroidered to mirror her natural markings. She took a deep breath and began her walk toward Amir, toward her future on this planet that was not her own. Even across galaxies, love finds a way. The officiant began when Leela reached the altar and took Amir's hands in hers. The beautiful moment was suddenly interrupted by the distant wail of police sirens growing steadily louder. Amir's face fell as he looked toward the sound, then back at his bride's worried expression. "It'll be okay," he whispered, squeezing her hands. But the sirens kept getting closer, and the guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. From her window, Mrs. Wilson watched with grim satisfaction as the first police car turned onto their street. The gate to the backyard swung open with a loud crash as 3 police officers rushed in. Their hands hovered near their weapons, faces set in professional masks of authority. Behind them, Mrs. Wilson hurried to keep up, her house slippers slapping against the stone path as she pointed a bony finger toward the wedding march. "That's them. Right there," Mrs. Wilson called out, her voice cutting through the beautiful music and bringing the ceremony to an abrupt halt. "These aliens are infiltrating our neighborhood. They're gathering for some kind of ritual." The guests turned in their seats, murmurs of confusion and distress spreading through the crowd. Amir instinctively stepped in front of Leela, his shoulders tense. Layla placed a gentle blue hand on his arm, her luminescent patterns pulsing with anxiety. "Sir, please step aside," the lead officer called out, a tall man with a crew cut and stern expression. "We received a report of suspicious alien activity at this address." Amir didn't move. "This is our wedding. We have all proper permits for the gathering." The officer took another step forward, then suddenly froze. His eyes widened as he got a clear look at Layla's face behind her partially lifted veil. His hand, which had been hovering near his weapon, slowly dropped to his side. "Ambassador Layla, is that you?" he asked, his authoritative tone replaced by one of disbelief. Layla stepped around Amir, her ceremonial gown rustling softly. The patterns on her blue skin dimmed slightly with her sadness. "Yes, officer, it's me," she confirmed, her musical voice carrying across the now silent backyard. Today was supposed to be just about love. Not politics, not treaties, not diplomacy. Just 2 people committing to each other. The officer removed his cap in a gesture of respect. "I'm so sorry for the interruption, Ambassador." Mrs. Wilson pushed her way forward, her face flushed with anger and confusion. "What are you doing? You need to remove these creatures. They could be planning anything." The lead officer turned to Mrs. Wilson, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, do you have any idea who she is?" "Of course I do," Mrs. Wilson sputtered, pointing accusingly at Layla. "She's an illegal alien. They're all illegal. They don't belong here." The officer shook his head slowly. "She's the diplomat who negotiated the medicine treaty between Earth and Vexilia 3 years ago." His voice softened slightly. "My daughter was diagnosed with Lennox syndrome. She would have died without the treatment developed by Vexillian scientists. My daughter is alive because of her work." Mrs. Wilson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The 2 other officers exchanged looks, one of them shifting uncomfortably. "Ambassador," the second officer said, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. "I had no idea this was your residence. My sister volunteers at the Children's Hospital downtown. The medicines your people shared have saved hundreds of lives there." Layla acknowledged this with a small nod, though her luminescent patterns remained dim with distress. Amir took her hand, squeezing it gently. "This is our home," Amir explained, his voice steady despite the tension. "And these are our friends and family gathered to celebrate our marriage." Everything is legal and registered with both Earth authorities and the Vexillian embassy. The lead officer turned to his colleagues. Stand down. There's no threat here. He looked back at the couple. Ambassador, Mr. Rahman, I deeply apologize for this interruption. From the front row, Amir's father stood up. If there's no problem here, officers, perhaps you could allow my son and his bride to continue their ceremony. The officers nodded and began to back away. But Mrs. Wilson wasn't finished. She stepped forward again, her finger jabbing the air. You can't just leave. They don't belong here. In our neighborhood. They look different. They act different. Ma'am, the lead officer interrupted firmly. You filed a false report. There is no suspicious activity happening here. Ambassador Layla is a respected diplomat with full Earth residency status. An older man in a suit stood up from among the guests. As Vexillian ambassador to Earth, I can confirm that this gathering is fully sanctioned by both governments. Mrs. Wilson looked around desperately, seeking support but finding none. Even the officers were now looking at her with disapproval. If you continue to disrupt this private ceremony, the lead officer told her quietly, I'll have to ask you to return to your home or face charges of harassment. This isn't over, Mrs. Wilson muttered, backing away. They're still not like us. As Mrs. Wilson retreated toward the gate, the young female officer stepped toward Layla and Amir. Would it be inappropriate if we stayed? Just for the ceremony. My daughter would never forgive me if I told her I had left Ambassador Layla's wedding. Layla's patterns brightened slightly, a Vexillian expression of cautious hope. She looked at Amir, who nodded with a small smile. You're welcome to stay, Layla told the officers. On Vexillia, we believe that even difficult beginnings can lead to beautiful journeys together. The officers took seats at the back as the officiant cleared his throat and found his place again in the ceremony. Amir and Layla turned back to face each other, hands joined, as the guests settled. From her kitchen window, Mrs. Wilson watched in bitter disappointment as the ceremony resumed. She couldn't understand why everyone else couldn't see what she saw. The danger of these aliens living among them, pretending to be just like humans. Sooner or later, she told herself, everyone would realize she had been right all along. As the ceremony resumed, Mrs. Wilson stood at the edge of the yard, unable to leave despite her humiliation. Something kept her rooted to the spot, perhaps a desire to see if the police would eventually come to their senses. The vows were exchanged, rings placed on fingers, and the officiant had just pronounced them married when a sharp beeping sound cut through the applause. A small device on Layla's wrist, which everyone had assumed was simply a decorative bracelet, suddenly lit up with flashing red lights. The cheerful atmosphere evaporated instantly as Layla's face changed from joy to alarm. She tapped the device twice, and a small holographic display appeared above her wrist. What is it? Amir asked, his voice low and concerned. Layla's luminescent patterns pulsed rapidly in what Mrs. Wilson recognized as distress. The alien bride looked up, her eyes scanning the sky before returning to her new husband. Incoming hostile vessels detected, she announced, her musical voice now commanding and clear. Earth's outer defenses have been breached. Murmurs of concern rippled through the wedding guests, but strangely, there was no panic. Mrs. Wilson expected screams, people running, chaos. But instead, there was a strange, coordinated tension spreading through the crowd. Amir stepped forward, and Mrs. Wilson watched in confusion as his entire demeanor transformed. Gone was the nervous groom with trembling hands. In his place stood a man with military bearing, shoulders squared, and jaw set with determination. Code authorization, Phoenix 7, he stated firmly, his voice carrying across the yard. What happened next made Mrs. Wilson wonder if she was dreaming. The beautiful flower arch where the couple had just exchanged vows split down the middle, revealing a control panel filled with blinking lights. The strings of decorative bowls hanging in the trees suddenly brightened, projecting a dome-like grid pattern over the entire backyard. Even the wedding cake on the refreshment table slid aside as a communications array rose from beneath the tablecloth. Most shocking of all were the wedding guests themselves. As one, they stood from their chairs. Several pulled devices from hidden pockets or removed what appeared to be disguises. Mrs. Wilson gasped as one human guest's face seemed to shimmer and reveal green-tinted skin beneath. Another removed what must have been colored contacts, exposing eyes with vertical pupils. "What's happening?" Mrs. Wilson whispered, though no one was paying her any attention now. Layla turned to Amir, her blue features showing genuine surprise despite the crisis unfolding around them. "You're not just a nurse?" she asked, studying her new husband as if seeing him for the first time. Amir gave her a small, apologetic smile as he activated the control panel that had emerged from the wedding arch. "Earth Defense Command, Special Operations Division," he explained. "And I'm guessing you're not just a diplomat, are you?" Layla's luminescent patterns shifted to a pattern Mrs. Wilson had never seen before, pulsing with what seemed like embarrassment and amusement despite the crisis. "Royal Security Force," she admitted. "My diplomatic role is real, but it's also my cover." One of the police officers who had stayed for the ceremony stepped forward, removing his uniform jacket to reveal a fitted black tactical suit underneath. "Ambassador, Commander Rahman, we're receiving reports of multiple breach points. First wave estimated in 20 minutes. Mrs. Wilson felt her knees weaken. She grabbed onto the fence for support as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. "This can't be real," she muttered. "This can't be happening." The lead police officer noticed her distress and approached, his expression surprisingly gentle. "Mrs. Wilson, you should return to your home immediately. It's not safe out here." "What's going on?" she demanded, finding her voice at last. "Who are these people? What are they doing?" The officer glanced back at the rapidly transforming wedding scene. "Saving us all, ma'am. Now please, get inside." But Mrs. Wilson couldn't move. She watched as Amir took charge of one group of guests-turned-operatives, directing them to defensive positions around the perimeter of the yard. Layla had gathered another group around the communications array, speaking rapidly in a language Mrs. Wilson had never heard before. "I don't understand," Mrs. Wilson said weakly. "You're all working together?" "Earth has been part of the Galactic Defense Alliance for 5 years now, ma'am," the officer explained quickly. "Most civilians don't know the full extent of our integration because, well, people tend to fear what they don't understand." From the sky came a distant rumble, like thunder but somehow wrong. Too rhythmic, too mechanical. Several guests looked up, their expressions grim. "They're entering the atmosphere," someone called out. Amir crossed the yard to Layla's side, taking her hand briefly despite the chaos around them. "Some wedding date, huh?" "Not quite what I planned," Layla admitted with a small smile. "But I suppose it reveals all our secrets at once." "Almost all," Amir replied mysteriously, before turning to address the gathered operatives. "Defense grid to full power. Communication blackout protocols in effect. This is not a drill, people." Mrs. Wilson watched as the alien bride she had reported to the police removed the delicate veil from her head and tossed it aside. Beneath it, attached to her ceremonial headpiece, was what appeared to be advanced technology that hummed to life as she activated it. "Royal Security Channel open," Layla announced. "This is Commander Layla of House Thuran. Earth defensive status. Engaged. Requesting immediate backup from all allied forces in this sector." Mrs. Wilson slumped against the fence, her worldview shattering around her. The aliens she had feared and hated weren't infiltrating Earth to destroy it. They were here to protect it, working alongside humans like Amir. And now something was coming, something bad enough to turn a wedding into a military operation in seconds. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself as the sky darkened above them. Mrs. Wilson stood frozen at the fence, watching as the blue sky above them darkened. At first it looked like storm clouds gathering with unnatural speed, but then she saw them. dark shapes moving within the clouds, metallic surfaces catching what little sunlight remained. Enemy ships, just as they had said, descending toward Earth, toward her neighborhood, toward the very wedding she had tried to shut down. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her fingers gripping the wooden fence so tightly her knuckles turned white. The wedding party, now revealed as some kind of military unit, moved with practiced precision. The chaos Mrs. Wilson had expected earlier now materialized, but not as panicked confusion, rather as coordinated emergency response. Wedding guests pulled equipment from hidden compartments in the decorations. Some took defensive positions around the perimeter, while others gathered around what had been the cake table, now clearly a command center. Amir stood at its center, the nervous groom completely gone. He spoke with authority into a communications device, his voice calm but urgent. "All Earth defense stations, this is Commander Rahman. We have visual confirmation of hostile Drachnid vessels entering lower atmosphere. Activating Defense Protocol Echo 9. Request immediate backup at Grid 37B." Beside him, Layla had removed the outer layer of her wedding gown, revealing a fitted suit underneath that seemed to shimmer with embedded technology. Her hands moved quickly as she activated various devices, built into what Mrs. Wilson had thought were simply pieces of ceremonial jewelry. "Kinetic barriers deploying," Layla announced, twisting a bracelet on her wrist. A faint blue glow spread outward from her position, expanding in a dome-like shape until it covered the entire backyard and beyond, encompassing several houses on the block, including Mrs. Wilson's home. Mrs. Wilson watched in awe as the protective shield settled into place, nearly invisible except for a slight distortion in the air, like heat rising from pavement on a hot day. Above them, the enemy ships were now clearly visible, dark, angular vessels with red lights pulsing along their hulls. "Targeting systems locked," one of the former wedding guests reported. "Defense turrets ready." Mrs. Wilson hadn't even noticed the defensive weapons that had emerged from the ground around the property's perimeter, disguised until now as landscape lighting. "Hold fire until they breach the upper atmosphere," Amir ordered. "We need to draw them away from civilian areas if possible." Layla looked up from her control panel, her eyes meeting Mrs. Wilson's across the yard. Without hesitation, she crossed the space between them, her movements graceful despite the crisis unfolding around them. "We need to evacuate civilians," Layla said, looking directly at Mrs. Wilson. "You should come with me to the shelter beneath our house." Mrs. Wilson stared at the blue hand extended toward her, unable to comprehend why this woman, this alien, would offer help after what had happened. "Why would you protect me? After what I did?" Mrs. Wilson whispered, shame washing over her as she remembered her hateful words, her call to the police. Layla's luminescent patterns pulsed gently on her blue skin. "Because that's what humans taught me," she replied, her voice kind despite the urgency of the moment. "Forgiveness. It's one of your species' most beautiful qualities, when you choose to embrace it." Mrs. Wilson hesitated, then slowly reached out to take Layla's hand. The alien's skin was warm, slightly textured, but not so different from human touch. A deafening sound filled the air as the first enemy ship fired. A red beam of energy struck Layla's shield, making the entire protective dome vibrate and flash with absorbed energy. "Shield holding at 80%, someone called out. "Return fire, defensive pattern Alpha," Amir ordered. The hidden defense turrets activated, firing blue pulses of energy upward toward the invading ships. One struck a smaller vessel, sending it spinning sideways in a trail of smoke. "We need to move now," Layla urged, still holding Mrs. Wilson's hand. "The shield won't hold forever against sustained." Her words cut off as another enemy beam struck, this one creating a visible crack in the protective dome. Layla looked up, her alien eyes widening as she calculated something in an instant. "Get down," she shouted, releasing Mrs. Wilson's hand only to push her forcefully to the ground. Mrs. Wilson fell hard onto the grass as a third beam penetrated the damaged shield. Time seemed to slow as she watched Layla raise both arms, her ceremonial bracelets glowing intensely as she attempted to reinforce the failing barrier. The enemy beam sliced through, heading directly toward where Mrs. Wilson had been standing moments before. Layla managed to deflect most of the energy, but not all of it. A portion of the beam struck her side, sending her spinning to the ground with a cry of pain. The air filled with the strange scent of ozone and something alien, perhaps Layla's blood. "Layla!" Amir's voice cut through the chaos as he ran toward his fallen bride. Mrs. Wilson crawled toward Layla, horrified by what had happened. The blue woman had saved her life, had taken a hit meant for her. "Unfunctional," Layla gasped, her words clipped with pain. The side of her wedding outfit was scorched, revealing damaged blue skin beneath. Shield integrity compromised Sector 7. Rerouting power. "Stop talking shop and let me see," Amir said, his commander's voice giving way to concern as he knelt beside her. Mrs. Wilson found her voice at last. "She saved me. Why would she do that? I tried to ruin your wedding. I called the police. I said terrible things." Amir glanced at her, his expression complex. Anger, frustration, but also understanding. "That's who she is. That's who we try to be." He turned back to examine Layla's wound. "And right now, I need to get both of you to safety." Above them, the battle intensified as more defense ships arrived, engaging the enemy vessels. The sky flickered with exchanges of energy weapons, the sound of explosions rolling across the neighborhood like apocalyptic thunder. "Can you walk?" Amir asked Layla, who nodded grimly. "Help me get her up," Amir said to Mrs. Wilson. "We need to reach the bunker before the shield fails completely." Mrs. Wilson moved without hesitation, supporting Layla's injured side, as Amir took her other arm. Together, the unlikely trio began making their way toward the house, while around them, what should have been a wedding day continued to transform into humanity's most unexpected line of defense. The morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban street as Mrs. Wilson stood nervously on the front porch of her neighbor's home. 1 month had passed since the attack, since the day she had tried to ruin their wedding, and instead witnessed them save not just her life but the entire planet. In her trembling hands, she held a bouquet of blue and white flowers, the colors carefully chosen to match Layla's skin and traditional Earth wedding blooms. The neighborhood had changed since that day. The government couldn't keep the attack completely secret, though many details remained classified. Most people knew only that Earth had faced an alien threat and that a combined human-alien defense force had repelled it. What they didn't know was that the front line had been a wedding in a quiet suburban backyard. Mrs. Wilson took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. The soft chime echoed inside the house. She nearly turned to leave, courage failing, when the door swung open. Layla stood in the doorway, dressed in casual Earth clothes, jeans, and a simple blouse, though nothing could disguise her beautiful blue skin with its luminescent patterns. Her right arm was encased in a transparent medical device that hummed softly, healing the injury she had sustained while protecting Mrs. Wilson. "Mrs. Wilson," Layla said, surprise evident in her musical voice. "Good morning." Mrs. Wilson extended the flowers awkwardly, eyes fixed on the welcome mat. "I brought these to say thank you. And I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry for everything." Layla accepted the flowers with her uninjured hand, her patterns brightening in what Mrs. Wilson now recognized as pleasure. "These are beautiful," Layla said. "Would you like to come in for tea? Amir just made some." Mrs. Wilson looked up, startled by the invitation. "You want me to come in? After everything I did?" Layla stepped aside, holding the door open. "The past is behind us. Please, join us." With hesitant steps, Mrs. Wilson entered the home she had watched with suspicion for so long. Inside, it was surprisingly normal, comfortable furniture, books on shelves, family photos on the walls. But there were unique touches too, strange crystalline sculptures that caught the light and alien plants that seemed to move slightly even without a breeze. Amir appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups. His warm smile showed no trace of resentment. "Mrs. Wilson, welcome," he said, setting the tray on the coffee table. "Please, have a seat." As Mrs. Wilson settled into an armchair, her eyes were drawn to the photos displayed on the wall. Many showed Amir and Layla together, hiking in mountains, laughing at what appeared to be an office party, standing before famous landmarks. They looked so happy, so normal despite their differences. Newer photos caught her attention. Amir and Layla visiting schools, surrounded by children of various ages, some human and some clearly not. One image showed Layla demonstrating how the patterns on her skin could change color, while delighted children watched in awe. Most surprising was a photo Mrs. Wilson hadn't expected. Herself, taken just last week at the community center, helping a newly arrived alien family understand how to use Earth appliances. Her face in the picture showed concentration, but also something else, a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. "You've been doing wonderful work at the center," Layla commented, following her gaze. "The Solarian family you helped speaks very highly of you." Mrs. Wilson felt her cheeks warm. "It's not much. Just showing them how the washing machine works, how to use the stove without setting off the smoke alarm. It means everything to them," Amir said, pouring tea into delicate cups. Being welcomed, being treated with kindness, especially from someone they know once might have feared them. The tea had an unusual fragrance, earth chamomile, mixed with something else, something not from this world. Mrs. Wilson accepted the cup cautiously, but found the flavor surprisingly pleasant. "I don't understand how you can forgive me so easily," she said after taking a sip. "I called the police on your wedding. I said horrible things. And then you helped carry me to safety when I was injured," Layla pointed out. "You stayed in the shelter with the others, keeping them calm during the attack. You've been volunteering at the integration center ever since." "Sometimes," Amir said, sitting beside his wife on the sofa, "it takes seeing someone's true heart in a crisis to change your own." Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly, finally understanding. "I was so afraid of what was different. I never stopped to learn, to understand." She looked up at the couple. "When you pushed me out of the way of that beam, why did you do it? You could have died." Layla's patterns shifted to a deep, thoughtful blue. "On my world, we have a saying. The hand that reaches out to help another strengthens both. I didn't think about what you had done. I only knew you needed protection." Through the living room window, Mrs. Wilson could see other neighbors walking by. Human families alongside alien residents who had moved into the community since the attack. Children of different species played together on front lawns. The neighborhood had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. "I spent so many years alone in that house," Mrs. Wilson admitted. "After my husband died, I just closed myself off. It was easier to be angry than to be lonely." "You're not alone anymore," Layla said gently. "None of us are." Amir reached for his wife's hand, their fingers intertwining. Blue against brown, alien against human, yet perfectly matched. "We're having a small gathering next weekend," he said. "A proper celebration of our marriage, since the first attempt was interrupted. We'd be honored if you would come." Mrs. Wilson felt tears prick at her eyes. "I would like that very much." As they continued talking, sharing stories and finding unexpected common ground, Mrs. Wilson realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in fearing differences or building walls against the unknown. It was in reaching across boundaries, in forgiveness, in the courage to change. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and for the first time in years, Mrs. Wilson was no longer afraid to discover them.